Do we always go camping? Why do I have to go there for the school trip too? Please, Mom, I want to stay at home and play video games for once. I whined, following around my mom, who was busy doing house chores. Your school manipulated me into paying your camping fees. There's no way I'm going to let you go in vain, she said in a strict voice while loading clothes into the washing machine. But Mom, no buts. You're going there. End of conversation. Now move along. I have plenty of work on my hands. She walked off after finishing her sentence, and I couldn't help but helplessly sigh. I was never fond of things like camping trips and wilderness, but since this was the only idea of fun my family ever came up with every single holiday break, I had no other choice but to attend it. What crossed the limit when even my school organized the very same thing I had grown tired of, and my mom, being a pushover, handed the money to Miss Sandra, who was the teacher in charge of this trip. Now she was pushing me to go there. Finally, the day arrived, and after dropping me off at school with my luggage, Mom went to work. I wanted to run off right then and there, but I don't see why I hesitated. My friends Paul and Robert spotted me, and as they were coming to me, I could see their faces beaming up looking at how I was finally tagging along after clearly telling them that I didn't want to go. We went to the bus, and after putting our bags down, we took our seats. We reached the campsite at noon, and after having lunch, the teacher started with the activities they had planned. But the things they were making us do was utterly boring, as I had already grown tired of them after doing all of them multiple times with my cousins. Things took a turn when they made us do a scavenger hunt right before sunset. They hid cooking items around the area and gave each team the task of searching for them and making food for the team. The one who was to finish their meal first would be the winner. During the hunt, two kids, Marcus and Luca, from different teams came across the same item. Arguments started about who got there first, while none of them let the other party take it. As the commotion grabbed my attention, I stopped whatever I was doing and went there to see what was going on. I stood there watching the small argument turn into a heated one, without any intention of stepping forward and stopping them, as this seemed to be the only interesting thing about the entire trip. Marcus's hair ended up in Luca's fist, and he said something that I couldn't quite understand, which pissed him off. Within a matter of time, the fight turned violent, and each one of them was eating dirt by the other's hand. By the time teachers and the rest of the kids took notice, they have started bleeding from their noses, along with multiple bruises on their bodies. They were immediately taken inside of one of the tents and got first aid treatment. I don't think any of the kids knew half as much as I did after all those trips with my family. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done something as foolish as this. Camping was no easy thing for those who haven't done it before, and having those injuries was only going to make it worse for the rest of the trip for those two. I was determined to not give a damn about whatever transpired around me, so I shrugged it off and went back to getting bored. After such a brutal fight, one might think they were done with each other and might have probably learned their lesson, but that wasn't the case at all. It was when we were taking a dip in the lake when Marcus and Luca started a speech fight again, but stopped after receiving a scolding from the teacher, and she gave them another warning before heading to the camping area for something. About half an hour had already passed since I had started to swim, so I followed her to the camping area and got into my tent to change into a new pair of clothes. When I got out of the tent, I saw Miss Sandra setting up the food on the mat. "Isaac, can you be a deer and the other kids for lunch? The food's prepared?" I nodded my head in response, as she noticed me looking in the direction and asked me. Following her order, I went ahead and started calling the scattered kids one by one. When I got back, I noticed everyone was present near the mat except for Marcus and Luca. Something felt off. I remembered I last saw them swimming in the lake, but not after that. My eyes met with Miss Sandra, and judging by her expression, she was thinking the same as me. We both ran toward the lake and started looking for them when I found a panicked Marcus hiding behind a tree near the lake, but there was no sign of Luca. As he saw us, he started crying and pointing toward the lake where Luca was last swimming, along with repeating his name. This was the first time I felt thankful for all those trips and adventures with my family that taught me so many things. I immediately ran in that direction and dived upon reaching. Luckily, I found him drowning, and since he hadn't gotten too deep yet, I was able to pull him out. The teacher immediately started compressing his chest and performing CPR, and after a few failed attempts, he threw up a lot of water along with coughing. Since he was in urgent need of medical attention, she drove him to the nearest hospital she knew of, leaving us in the care of Mr. Goodman. Marcus confessed to him later on that they started to argue again, and when Luca slapped him, he got so angry that he started beating him in the water. He couldn't understand if his foot slipped or something else, but in the middle of the grapple, Luca started drowning. He didn't say anything after that and just started crying again, so none of us knows if he tried to save him or ran away after getting panicked. The trip ended there, and we were brought back home safely. I immediately rushed to tell Mom about everything that went on the trip, which made me scared for her, and she promised never to send me off to another school trip. I don't know about that. I mean, whatever happened was horrifying indeed, and I'm thankful that Luca's safe now. But for some reason, this was the most memorable and unique camping trip I had experienced. Hey guys, thanks so much for all the support. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please feel free to do so.
This incident happened to us when I was in the woods with my friend. His name was Samuel, and that was the last day when I saw him. We witnessed something inhuman in the woods, and were afraid, so we were returning as fast as we could, but in the process, I didn't notice that I had lost him, and after that day, he didn't return back to us. At that time, I lived in Selcone City, which was the last residential point before the vast jungle in Brazil. A few miles from our city, there was this huge and dense forest that was spread over more than 100 miles. My father was a police officer and was living about 8 hours away from my place. I lived in my house along with my mother and my younger sister. My father was living with us until I turned 16, but then he was transferred to another area, and now we were here without him. It was not like we were having any difficulty or facing a lot of problems without him, but the point was that we missed him very much. He used to send enough money for us to leave our life full of facilities and comforts. When he was with us, he used to take me to the woods for hunting and fishing at the lake, which was several miles deep into the woods, but that was his favorite place for fishing. I had been there many times before and also knew the route. But since his transfer, I have never visited there even once. It was a normal day, and I was sitting in my hall and watching TV when my friend who lived in my neighborhood came running to me and asked me to go into the forest for some hunting and fishing. I was getting bored of sitting in my room and watching TV, so I thought that it would be a good opportunity to go and visit that place again. I agreed with him and was excited to go there. This was the first time I was going into the woods without him. I asked him to prepare our stuff and meet here again in the next 15 minutes. I went to my room and changed into my dad's hunting uniform and took the fishing rod along with a rifle that was for hunting and waited for my friend to come. He reached there after 20 minutes and apologized to me for keeping me waiting. I didn't mind that thing, and from there, we started our trip to the woods. It was a nice, sunny day, and the time was around 3 p.m. After half an hour, we reached the starting point of the forest, and then started our journey into the woods. As we walked into the woods, we found only vegetation that was growing even denser after every step. Back then, when I came here with my dad, this route was totally clear. But maybe we hadn't visited this forest for years, and in between, the bushes grew, and the result was right in front of our eyes. After walking for about an hour, we reached a very dense part of the forest that surrounded most of that area, and till that time, we were very tired and hungry. So, I asked my friend to take out some snacks that we carried to enjoy in the woods. We sat there and ate a little snack to get back into action, but with full energy. After this, we continued our search for my dad's favorite fishing place. We kept on walking ahead, but didn't find anything other than dense bushes and trees. It was getting harder to cut through the vegetation. But it seemed God heard our voices, and we heard the voice of flowing water. I knew for sure that it was the same spot where my dad always took me, and I was right about that. After clearing the bushes, we could easily see the lake. We were feeling very tired and completely exhausted, so we decided to sit and rest for a while on the grass. We were resting there when my friend felt thirsty and went to the lake to drink some water. While drinking water, he noticed something on the opposite side of the lake. At first, he didn't see that clearly and ignored it. But as soon as he stood up after drinking water, he started to shake after watching what he saw there. I went to him and asked him what he saw, whether it was some wild animal or something. He didn't say anything, but pointed his fingers towards the opposite side of the lake. I looked there, and I couldn't explain to you what I saw there. We saw something that was out of our imagination and was a totally inexplicable thing. On the other side of the lake, there was a small, clear, sand-made area, and imprinted on it was a huge footprint. It was really too huge, and we both knew that no normal human or animal could have made it. We were both too afraid and went there while shaking our boots. After reaching there, we came to know that the footprint was about 30 times greater in size than ours. We looked at that footprint clearly and examined it. Soon, we realized that it was completely inhuman, and we suddenly started to feel even more terror in our hearts. We rushed back without so much as a peep, and we kept on running through the dense bushes without looking back. After running continuously for about an hour, I reached outside the forest, and at that time, I realized that Samuel was not with me. I looked back and waited for him, since I thought he must have got caught or struck into the bushes. But several minutes passed, and he didn't return. I screamed and shouted his name so that he could identify my voice and come back to me, but everything was in vain. I waited for him for the next 2 hours, but when he didn't return back, I got worried about him and went running back to my home. I reached my home and called the cops and explained everything to them. They came to me after about 30 minutes and took a photograph of him. This time, I also told them about the footprint that I saw deep in the forest. They took all the information they needed from me and started their investigation. After that day, I waited for their call every day, but they didn't contact me ever again. And as far as my friend is concerned, he never returned to me ever again. Every time I explained this story to my other friends, they made fun of me and they always asked me to take them with me to the same spot. But whatever that huge footprint belonged to, one thing was sure, that it scared the hell out of us. And also, even today, I kept on thinking about where in the world did my friend go.
For the hunting season of 2017, I got in on a lease with a guy from work. I didn't have time to check the area out before the season started, so the inevitable occurred and I got lost my first day. That morning I left the camp just before dawn. I'm not the kind that hunts from a stand. I'm your traditional stalk and shoot type of hunter. Since I wasn't familiar with the lease and I stupidly left my GPS back at the camp, I had to stick to the main paths in order to not get lost. Most of the morning I did well. However, as I grew tired, I lost focus and veered from the trail. In my defense, I came across this really fresh set of tracks. Of course, I had to follow them. The sucky thing was that they continued on to a neighboring property and I had to stop following them. When I looked up, I realized I was way off the trail and didn't know how to get back. The rest of the day was spent trying to find my way back to camp. About an hour before dark, I noticed a rundown house and cabin in the distance. By now, I wasn't sure whose property I was on. I hoped that if somebody was living there, they could help me, but as I got closer, I could tell the place had been abandoned for a good while. I knocked to make sure, but with no reply, I made myself at home. My first goal was to get a fire going. After I did that, I began combing through the cabinets for food and other things I thought could help me. Not much, but a questionable can of chili and some candles were found. I heated up the chili over the fire and combined it with a half-eaten bag of chips. After dinner, I looked through the bedroom and discovered an old map of the area. I wasn't sure how accurate it would be after all that time, but I was happy to find it. I spread it out on the floor in front of the fireplace and planned my course for the morning. I was shocked to see that I had veered over 5 miles from where I'd started. At some point, I must have dozed off. During the night, I had a super vivid dream that a man was sitting in the chair next to me and just staring. He never said a word. And when I jerked awake and saw that I was alone, I was relieved and quickly fell back asleep. The following morning, I woke up at 6:15 and got my stuff together. I made sure the fire was completely put out and headed back to camp. I just stepped from the house when I came face to face with a strange man. The guy from my dream, in fact. I was confused at first, and when he spoke, I knew my dream had really happened. This man was holding an old Marlin 30-30, not an odd sight for a hunter during deer season. This dude didn't look like a hunter, though. He wore an old, dirty backpack and normal, bright, yet dingy street clothes. His eyes had a very crazed look to them that made me uncomfortable to gaze at. I was surprised, but regained my calm and said, "Good morning." Instead of saying it back, he just stared at me with those crazed black eyes. I began to say something, but he interrupted and asked what I was doing in the cabin. Before I could answer, he blurted out that it was his place. I continued and explained what had happened the day before. The entire time I was telling him this, he was gripping the rifle so tightly his knuckles were beginning to turn white. His behavior was beginning to scare me. The only thing I wanted to do was get back to camp and then home. The last word had barely left my lips before he angrily told me that it was his place. It appeared to have been empty for quite a while, but I wasn't going to argue with him. I apologized as quickly as I could and went on my way. For a good 100 yards or more, I kept looking behind me. I was waiting to get shot in the back. Every time I looked back, he was staring maniacally back at me and death gripping his gun. It took a couple of hours to find my way back, but by then, I'd had plenty of time to dwell upon our encounter, and I was truly freaked out by then. It actually hit me. The guys that were still in camp were happy to see me and asked what had happened. I just said I got lost and camped out for the night, never mentioning the nutcase that I met. I doubt that they take it seriously anyhow. The whole experience had me so scared I wanted nothing more than get home. The other guys must have thought I was crazy. After throwing all my stuff into the back of my truck, I tore off out of there and never returned. I knew I'd never be able to feel safe knowing that kook was somewhere out in the woods, possibly watching our party. That following Monday, my friend asked what had caused me to leave so abruptly. I made up some lie about my wife being sick. I'm not sure if he even believed it. Nothing was said about it again, and maybe, just maybe, things are better that way.
In my early 20s, I went through a wandering stage. I had just graduated from college and couldn't find a job anywhere. Rather than go a couple $100s into the hole every month paying for rent while searching for a job, I decided to pack up with my few belongings I owned and headed out to see the country. And this is something I cannot recommend enough. Stay off the interstates, pop a train from time to time, and hitchhike with no particular destination in mind. It was this kind of aimless wandering that led me to the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. If you've never experienced them, the Barrens are an amazing place. Huge stands of oak and evergreen trees, many older than time itself, grow out of that strange, sickly soil. Sugar sand, the locals call it in the rainy season, that forms quicksand. And then the dry season, it can still swallow farm machinery whole. Of the few farms that I saw, they all looked like they had seen better times, and many looked like they had sat untouched for decades. There was something alluring about that place, a sort of ancient secret I was afforded glimpses of in the shadows when the wind stirred the trees. The sort of movement at the edge of your vision that follows you throughout the day, but disappears as soon as you turn your head. From time to time, I hiked down old dusty roads. An old pickup truck or a rusted-out car would bound over a hill toward me. Most times, the driver would eye me suspiciously and speed up as they approached. Occasionally, the driver would stop to talk to me for a few minutes. "What are you doing out here?" one old toothless man clad in overalls asked me wandering around. "Seeing what there is to see," I replied. The old man spat out a putrid brown stream into the dust. "Ain't nothing to see around here." When I asked the old man what he meant by that, he made a guttural, throaty sound. I wasn't sure if he was choking on his tobacco or bothered by the question, but he didn't answer. He offered me a ride in his pickup the way that I had come back into town. But when I declined, he spat out into the dirt again and sped off, shaking his head. My eventual plan was to make it to Delaware sometime that summer and meet up with some extended family there, but I was in no hurry. In truth, I had been in heaven these last few weeks, taking my time heading south and exploring anything that caught my eye. I had explored every abandoned building and every cave I had seen. I had half my weight in power bars in my backpack. But over the last 2 months, I had honed my skills at trapping rabbits and gathering wild edibles. Sitting up late at night beside my campfire and sleeping beneath the stars. The night sky in an area so devoid of human influence is beyond comprehension. But tonight, there were clouds moving in, and the sun was disappearing faster than I had grown accustomed to. When the deep roar of thunder shook the valley, I knew that I had better find shelter. In the failing sunlight, I could see in the distance some structures at the top of the hill. I ran the half-mile distance and was disappointed to see that the ancient house and barn were in terrible shape. The roof of the barn had been completely collapsed, and the upper 2 floors of this 3-story house had collapsed into a mangle of ancient wood. Still, the house was my best option, so I made my way toward it as the heavens began to open up. As I'd seen on other properties in the area, this house had a small cemetery in the yard. I ran toward the gaping front door of the dilapidated house, carefully making my way between the headstones. When lightning flashed, I was able to make out the name on several of the headstones, which the elements hadn't completely erased. When they got inside, the floor was spongy, but felt solid enough to hold my weight. I took off my pack and set it near the door, caught my breath, and had a look around. The hinges of the front door had long since rusted away, but I was able to fit the door back into the opening enough to hopefully keep the wind and rain out. At one end of the room, there was a stone fireplace and chimney which was solidly constructed, but I had no wood for a fire. Next to the fireplace was a stairwell full of rubble and cobwebs. I didn't dare apply my weight to those steps, as many had rotted to nothing under their own pitiful weight. Opposite the front door was an opening to an old kitchen of sorts, but when I tried to approach it, my foot went clean through the floor, and I decided to stay put until the storm blew over. The remains of the upper floor did an adequate job of keeping the ground floor dry, and I was able to arrange my sleeping bag so that very little water draining from the upper floors managed to land on it. I got out my harmonica and played for a few minutes, then stopped, apprehensive. I didn't know what I was afraid of, but something had chilled me to my core. Outside, the storm had continued to build in intensity. My eyes were focused on that stairwell, seeing nothing in darkness, and flash blinded when lightning struck. I must have fallen asleep at some point because suddenly I came to with a searing pain in my neck from leaning my head against the wall for so long. Outside, the storm continued to pound down its fury upon Earth. As I sat there, rubbing my neck, and began to chuckle to myself for getting wrapped up in the superstition of the area when I heard it. At first, I heard indiscriminate movement of stairs and the ruins of the upper 2 floors. I was just about to write it off as rats when suddenly it stopped. I froze in place, daring only to move my eyes, and even then, just barely. After 30 seconds of paralytic fear, I smiled at myself again and was just about to settle into my sleeping bag when I looked toward the stairs. At the top of the doorway were a pair of glowing red orbs staring directly at me. Very slowly, they closed down to horizontal slits, then opened up again wider than before. I can't tell you how long I sat there staring at it, staring at me. It could have been a second. It could have been hours. And eventually, my lower-level self-preservation skills began to kick in, and subconsciously, I started reaching for the knife on my belt. Our eyes locked. My hand progressed inch by inch towards my only means of defending myself. Neither of us blinked for what felt like hours, and while the storm raged on, I prayed for another lightning strike so that I might even catch a glimpse of my adversary. But despite the ferocity of the rain, the darkness was absolute. When, at last, my hand reassuringly touched the hilt of my knife, it seemed as if the very fabric of existence was ripped to shreds. The creature began bellowing in the most unearthly, mind-numbing shriek I'd ever heard, Knowing I only had one chance, in one fluid motion, I released the snap that held my knife in place and released an inside overhand throw that I had practiced during my years of my misspent adolescence. I heard a sickening, wet thunk, and the shrieking increased in volume 100-fold. As I smashed that rotten door to pieces, I heard the creature flapping against the wall and screaming. Just as I wrenched the remains of the door open, a great flash of lightning struck. And all around the house, I saw piles of bones, feathers, and fur. I ran as I had never run before, since I ran into my veins pumped acid and my limbs were stone. I couldn't see where I was going, but I could follow the dirt roads by the sounds of the sugar sand slipping roadside debris into the ditches. I didn't dare look over my shoulder. When the sun finally rose, I collapsed in the middle of the road. Heaving, oblivious to the downpour, I awoke with a startle to the sound of a car horn blaring inches from my head. I leaped to my feet and spun around to see the same old man from yesterday holding his sides with laughter. When I opened my mouth to speak, he motioned with his thumb to the back of his truck. I climbed in without a word, and he began to drive. The events of the previous night had began to replay themselves in my head. What had just happened? No matter how many times I considered what I saw, none of it made any sense. As we drove, I realized how far I had run in the dark. It must have been nearly 10 miles. I was angry with myself for being so terrified by a dream. And that's the only thing that could have been approached from this angle. Everything fit into place and experienced a false awakening. There's so many times in the past when experimenting with dream herbs. I had a nightmare and woke up with adrenaline pumping and abandoned all of my gear in an old house. I suddenly realized that the truck had sat motionless for quite some time, and the old man was turned around in the seat, staring at me. I looked up at him, and he grinned. With sickening horror, I realized that we were at the bottom of the hill on which that wretched house sat. I jumped out of the pickup and thanked the old man who drove off. I slowly walked up the muddy path that led to the house, composing myself. When I reached the yard, I saw the old piles of bones, which had shocked me the previous night during the storm. Of course, there were coyotes and foxes in the area, and I had hunted a couple wild turkeys. The critters probably had their dens around here, and they had been using the house as a windbreak. Inside the house, everything appeared as I had left it. My sleeping bag, my pack, and my harmonica was sitting on the floor, and I could see my knife sticking out of the wall across the room. I packed everything up and put on my backpack, then walked over to the stairs and pulled my knife out of the wall. I was about to return it to the sheath on my belt when I looked at the blade and noticed the dried-on blood and that clump of oily black hair stuck to it.